Over time, the preservation community has broadened our idea of what is historic and worthy of protecting to be more inclusive of our country's vast cultural background. We are understanding that preservation is not just about the materials that make up buildings, but about the people that designed them, built in them, lived in them, worked in them, and experienced the building as part of their daily lives, and how these places shaped our communities and our history as a whole. So I wanted to start out tonight with one of my favorite quotes. In the end, our society will be defined not only by what we create, but by what we refuse to destroy. I think this is a great quote because it recognizes how important what we decide to preserve is to who we feel like we are. We typically demonstrate value by where we elect to invest our resources. By investing in the conservation, restoration, and preservation of historic sites and artifacts, we show that we value them. But when did we as a country begin to value our own history? As a relatively young nation, and one who revolted against our early heritage, it took time for our earliest history to be valued enough to protect, and time for it to become old enough to be thought of as historic. So let's take a quick look at how the preservation movement emerged in the US with just a few highlights. The first places to be preserved based solely on their historic significance were directly associated with the founding of our country. In 1816, Independence Hall in Philadelphia was saved, and other buildings associated with the birth of our nation began to be recognized for their contribution to our country. Early in the preservation movement, emphasis was placed on homes of the founding fathers, and then buildings where they had visited or stayed. I'm sure you've heard the equivalent of George Washington once slept here, or Thomas Jefferson visited here on his way through town. The most notable of those efforts was by a woman named Anne Pamela Cunningham. In 1853, Anne's mother was traveling down the Potomac River by steamer and witnessed the poor condition of Washington's former estate. She wrote to Anne, "I was painfully distressed at the ruin and desolation of the home of Washington, and the thought passed through my mind, why was it that the women of this country did not try to keep it in repair if the men could not do it?" Anne was inspired and took up the cause of raising money to purchase and restore Mount Vernon by forming the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, one of the country's earliest preservation organizations. The Antiquities Act was the first national preservation law and provided penalties for destroying or injuring historic or prehistoric ruins or monuments on federal lands, and gave the president the power to designate national monuments. The value of historic preservation begins to be more recognized. Local societies are formed to identify, preserve, and celebrate sites with historic significance. The next few decades show a boom in historic house museums, especially in the 1950s when Americans have new cars and new highways to travel across the country, visiting the historic sites of small towns along the way. Local societies purchase and restore old houses and fill them with period-appropriate antiques, offering tours to the public. Most of these homes are associated with the wealthy elite and usually interpret only the stories of the main family or families. Here you see the Otis House, right here in Boston, which is headquarters for Historic New England, formerly known as SPNEA, or Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, which is the oldest and largest regional heritage organization in the nation. The Alliance offices are actually now located right in the top floor of the Otis House on your left there. So if you need us and you're willing to climb 4 flights of stairs, that's where we are. The next phase in the preservation movement are historic districts, which eventually are enacted across the country. Boston's first historic district was Historic Beacon Hill and was designated in 1955. Communities begin to recognize that architecture has significance in its own right, whether or not someone famous slept there. And that often, a city's most sought-after neighborhood is their historic neighborhood, and that these neighborhoods needed to be protected. The very first historic district was established in 1931 in Charleston, South Carolina. The National Historic Preservation Act created the National Register of Historic Places, established the Section 106 review process, and paved the way for further regulation of historic sites and resources. This year, we're celebrating 50 years of the National Historic Preservation Act and reflecting on how far we've come since 1966. We are realizing how much of what our society chooses to preserve is influenced by social and cultural trends, and we're evolving what historic preservation really means to us. But before we talk more about that, Erica is going to come and put the preservation of the Old South Meeting House into this broader timeline.
I had a chance to read some speeches over the last week or so that I hadn't read before. And so there are actually 3 speeches, one of which I had read before, but not for quite some time, and then there's 2 that I sort of discovered. And what I'd like to do is to share some details from some of the orators and the writers who supported the saving of Old South during that time period in the 1870s. And just kind of explore with you a little, share some of that, and along the way also share some of the other fun details about this very unique, I think, range of types of support that came in for the saving of this building. And I wanted to just make a note that in preparing for today's presentation, I was really inspired by the program series that we hosted here this spring, which was about kind of exploring different aspects of oratory and rhetoric. And I also want to note that 3 of those programs are available for viewing on WGBH Forum Network, and the speakers are John Stauffer, Celeste Wells, and Danny DeLeon, and Judith, and then the performer Judith Calaora. And it was a really very interesting series, and I encourage you to explore it if you weren't able to actually be here for those programs. I also want to acknowledge a really helpful piece of research that was done by someone before my time here that I have drawn upon a lot, and I just would like to acknowledge the master's thesis about Old South Meeting House's preservation, which was done by Jeffrey Paul Robinson at UMass Boston in 2010. So that's where I kind of got a lot of the sort of helped me to kind of work through this story of the preservation. What I have here, we will be looking at this in a few moments. Again, the same image in another context, but this is an image of Old South Meeting House on Flag Day, which is June 14th, 1876. So it's the centennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and this is the day that Wendell Phillips selected to give a presentation here at Old South to try to raise funds for basically an emergency preservation of the building, which was about to be demolished. And this was a little bit of the speech. Actually, this is a speech that he gave later. So this is one of the other 2 speeches that I just stumbled upon, which was fabulous. Another fabulous speech that he gave in 1878 when he compared the meeting house to John Hancock's mansion, which had been demolished 15 years before. Taking us back a little bit, 100 years or so, there is a long history of destruction and near destruction of this building. People often ask, looking around inside, is anything original here? And well, there's not too much that we can see on the inside that dates from the building of the construction of this building in 1729. Save there's the stairway over there between the first and the second balconies is structurally the original stairway. And one of the reasons for that is that in 1775, the British Light Dragoons, this British soldiers that were stationed here in Boston during the beginning of the Revolutionary War, came in and tore out most of the interior to use this building as a riding school for their horses. You can see how they did keep one of the balconies over here, the balcony side here, where they had apparently the officers would sit and socialize up there while the ordinary soldiers rode the horses around and helped them to exercise down here. So it was a little bit of entertainment for the officers in the balcony. Oh, and I also wanted to just mention that the plaque on the balcony here is referring to that event and the fact that General George Washington, after the soldiers had had left Boston, apparently stood up on the balcony there and bemoaned the destruction of the inside of the building by the troops. So that was 100 years earlier, a little bit of earlier sort of destruction of the building. The congregation rebuilt after that, and now we've gotten to about 100 years later. Late in 1872, the congregation, now original congregation here was Puritan, now they called themselves Congregationalists. They announced plans to build a new church in another part of town. So we saw in 1872 the Great Fire here, downtown Boston. Another near destruction of Old South Meeting House just barely escaped that fire. And it was getting to be kind of grimy and noisy here in this bustling downtown. It was sort of a combination of noise and kind of sort of a sense of being run down, because really the whole downtown area was largely leveled by that fire. And the congregation decided at this time to make a move and to build a new church. So they built the Old South Church, which came to be known as the new Old South Church, which some of you may be familiar with. Still standing, still beautiful, still across from the Boston Public Library in Copley Square. And they have in their chapel the clock that used to hang here. This is a replica of that clock, the Willard clock. The original Willard clock, I guess, looks exactly like that one, but I like it better because I know it's the original one. Ours, though, does work. Apparently that one doesn't work anymore, so it's kind of a, it's a trade-off. But in any case, we have the new building. The construction on the new building started in late 1873. In the meantime, here, the U.S. Post Office set up quarters in the meeting house. And some apparently have said that the post office perhaps did more damage to this building than the British troops did 100 years earlier. Not only did they, you can kind of see how they made a lot of changes to the interior of the building. They also added on a whole section to the sort of where we have the fruit stand out here now. Sort of that area was kind of, they actually made an extension on the building. From historic preservation standpoint, didn't take very great care of the building. So that was going on from 1873 to 1875. In late 1875, the Old South Church congregation finally, after some legal sort of struggle, they attained legal permission to sell this building. And soon after that, Reverend Manning blessed the new chapel in Copley Square. And then here, on June 8th, 1876, this building sold at auction for $1,350. And preparations for demolition of the building began immediately. So basically, the intention was to tear apart the building, sell the parts for scrap, and then to construct an office building in its place here. And we have here an image, which is a fairly recent image. Actually, it shows the day with the Revere bell that we have in our steeple now was being installed. That was 2011, and but I have it here because I love these images. They're so great. But you can see the clock there, and the steeple clock, which it's been repaired and so on, but it's been there and been working in that spot since 1770. And so it was a really symbolic thing when, on June 9th, the day after the building was sold, hundreds of people gathered around the building and watched as America's oldest clock was removed and lowered to the sidewalk. So a little bit of an opposite of what's happening here, where we're installing a bell in the steeple, a Paul Revere bell in the steeple after we haven't had one there for a long time. Symbol of hope and taking the old and adding it to the future, to sort of the opposite of that, of actually starting to take the building apart. The crowd included Louisa May Alcott and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Emerson later called the clock's removal, which he saw as symbolic to the owner's intent to bring the building down brick by brick, the, quote, ruination of Boston's history. On June 11th, a member of the Old South Church congregation named George Simmons presented the building's new owner with a check for $1,000, effecting the first stay of demolition in American history. It was a 7-day stay of demolition, which is a pretty short period of time. So a lot of pressure was on. So that was June 11th. And then on June 14th, so we get back to the Flag Day. So you can see oh, actually, I was wrong. I misspoke. This isn't actually the same image that I was thinking it was, but it's not. I was thinking that the middle image was the same as I showed earlier. This is a cartoon that was published I believe published in the Boston Globe, making a comment about, looking back to the Revolutionary War destruction by the British soldiers and their horses, and then saying, here we are, and this is the future, looks like the future. 1876, the, in quote unquote, preservation proposal, and it says on the top there, destroyed by the American people, 1876. So on this day, as I said earlier, June 14th, 1876, Flag Day, Wendell Phillips, an abolitionist and orator, delivered an impassioned speech here at Old South Meeting House. And as part of the event here that day, several $1,000s were raised. So we're making a little bit of progress. I will share a few short passages from that speech. 100 years ago, Phillips said, our fathers announced this sublime declaration that God intended all men to be free and equal. With how much pride, with what a thrill, with what tender and loyal reverence may we not hunt up and cherish and guard from change or desecration the spot where this marvelous enterprise began. Except the holy city, is there any more memorable or sacred place on the face of the earth than the cradle of such a change? This being the cradle of that great change. Scholars have grown old and blind, striving to put their hands on the very spot where bold men spoke or brave men died. Shall we tear in pieces the roof that actually trembled to the words which made us a nation? Let every man's daily walk catch one ray of golden light, and his pulse throb once each day nobly as he passes these walls. No gold, no greed can canker the heart of such a people. All right, so a few things to point out here. First of all, there's a lot of talk about men here, which is one of the things that I'll point out a little bit as we go along. No big surprise, it's the 1870s, but I want to point out the thing about the sort of the sense of purity of spirit, because we'll get back to that as I go through here. There's going to be a lot about purity of spirit and this sort of connection with the preservation story here. So the men theme. Interestingly, after this rally, Elizabeth Agassiz wrote to philanthropist Mary Hemingway, who we know and love here, expressing concern that the Meeting House's newly formed preservation committee consisted entirely of men. And that sort of reminds us to what we heard earlier about Anne Pamela Cunningham, who I wasn't familiar with before, but maybe women need to get involved. That was the message here. And therein lay the beginnings of what would be called what would come to be called the 20 Women of Boston, whose efforts and contributions would prove critical in securing this building's future. Also following the rally, the Preservation Committee received, luckily, an extension on the stay of demolition. The governor then petitioned for a further extension, and September 15th was set as a final deadline. So now we have a little bit of time to do some more fundraising. Mary Hemingway then came to the partial rescue. She wrote a check for $100,000, no small sum, to the Old South Society, and then secured a mortgage of $225,000 in order to save the building for the time being. So these are the probably not the best graphics here, but I guess I just wanted to share my excitement at finding these two other speeches. Very different. I actually I found out that so the president of Harvard, this President Eliot, can we be reminded of his, yes, Charles Eliot. This is this little report here contains the short speech that he did at the beginning of this meeting in Cambridge. I think it's really fascinating that apparently this was the first of a whole bunch of community meetings in and around Boston to really get a broad cross-section of private citizens to contribute towards this cause. So it was pretty, in addition to on a national level, was getting quite a lot of attention as well. And then the second one is the 1878. This was another speech by Wendell Phillips, different tone, a lot of the same messages, but this one was a speech to the Massachusetts legislature in 1878. I actually don't know the exact date it was given. I haven't yet been able to dig that information up. But two things. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about each. So even after, this is an important point here, okay? Because even after we opened our doors as a museum in 1877, and now we have the Old South Association exists as a nonprofit organization, the future of the building is not secure, all right? There's a really huge mortgage that needs to be paid off. So there's still a lot of fundraising that needs to happen. So ongoing fundraising and troubleshooting to pay off that mortgage followed, including one architect's proposed plan to place this building on top of an office building. I don't have the image in this, actually. It sort of was an afterthought. If I do this again or another version of it, I will probably include it. I believe we have it in the, we do have it in the exhibit in the back, right? It is in the, actually, can I see it? I can see it from here. Yeah, it's right back there. It also, that image, along with many other great ones, is also in the book that we have on the history, the architecture history of the building. So that was one possible solution that was put out. I believe that was dated 1878. Ultimately rejected. I haven't actually read the discussion, but I would love to. And let's see. So I just want to point out sort of about a little bit of the rhetoric of these speeches, especially I'm going to focus on the 1878 one that really sort of looks at Boston's history as symbolic of the national story, both the past story and also kind of an imagined future of where do we want to be going, according to the speaker's view. And I just want to point out here because it seems like it's something that I feel like I haven't heard really spoken about in this conversation before, and I haven't put it into the conversation, and I feel like it's important to mention it here, that the author I mentioned earlier, the scholar who did his thesis on the preservation of our building, Jeffrey Robinson, that he emphasized the Boston Brahmins' influence on the movement to save this building and other perceived symbols of an imagined sort of quote-unquote pre-immigrant America. So there's sort of a implication there that there's sort of an anti-immigrant, potentially racist sort of approach that they sort of underlied this movement. I just also would like to note that much of the rhetoric that was used to garner public support for the preservation of the Meeting House was in tone seemed to be highly inclusive and really focused on the common man, and I will say the common man because it was the common man, and that some of this rhetoric links the nation's future unity with the end of racism. Of course, we're looking at Wendell Phillips, so that would make sense, but it's really powerful how he kind of puts that across, really powerful. And while women were at the forefront of the activism to save the meeting house, much of the movement's rhetoric, as I said before, excludes women from the democratic all, including the claim of universal suffrage, which in reference to passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, Wendell Phillips that was part of his kind of rhetoric, was that that's part of what makes us great now and moving into the future. However, there's one poem in the collection of poems of the Old South, which was published as a preservation fundraiser in 1878, which I see as a feminist call to action, and I love this poem, and to me it's really fun to read. The title is The Old South, simple, by Julia Ward Howe, and it reads just in part, "Then woman comes with patient hand, with loving heart of high command, to save the counsels of the land. She has a royal will to say, you shall not tear one stone away. You disavow the spirit need, that avarice may build with heed the gilded monuments of greed." So again, we have this whole kind of concept of, purity of spirit versus greed and avarice, and this building and saving it represents the former. So I'll see that. I'll share a little bit more of that in Phillips's 1878 speech, which I'll read you a few excerpts from in just a moment. Just a little bit of attention to the speech by Frazee. So this is Harvard University's President Eliot, and this was, again, a public meeting in Cambridge in January of 1877. So this is really kind of relatively early. This was the first in the series of public meetings, as I said earlier. So he said, "If we have any faith in free speech, if we have any faith in freedom of public meeting, why, the Old South is the best shrine of that faith." And then he goes on to say, if the proprietor, remember that the Old South Church had, as an entity, they had basically engaged in a legal battle in order to get permission to sell this building. So they now do not have responsibility for it anymore. If the proprietors of the Old South Church didn't see it as their responsibility to preserve the meeting house for posterity, quote, "Shall we lose the building because they are poor in spirit? Their conduct should rather inspire us to prove that there is a better spirit in this community." And according to the transcript, the comment was met with applause. So I'm guessing that the Cambridge folks did make some donations to the cause. Let's see now what Wendell Phillips has to say about spirit, nation, and historic preservation in his 1878 speech delivered at the State House. Running through this speech is the theme of that moral education is crucial to the nation's strength and more important than other types of education. God calls us today to save the monuments, to make our children brave and wise. Monuments are in our streets, Phillips says, as mementos of great lives, the real wealth of the Commonwealth. Massachusetts is richer that Sam Adams lived here, that where the old South stands, Sewell, in the majesty of his repentance, gave to magistrates the noblest example that has ever been set the world over. And this was a reference to Sewell's public apology for his role in the Salem witch trials, which happened in the Old South Meeting House at that time. Phillips goes on to discuss New England as morally superior to the rest of the country. He really spends a lot of time talking about this. He's very clear that he thinks that New England is morally superior to the rest of the country. And he hopes that the New England character will spread across the continent. Quote, "In order to do that, we must emphasize and intensify the New England character," end quote. Preservation of our historic buildings, he suggests, is a way to achieve that. New England's moral superiority, according to his view, must spread in order to keep the nation united. Remember, we not long before ended a civil war, and part of the process will involve, as I said earlier, the end of racism. Phillips shares the story in this speech of an Arkansas slaveholder who, encountering John Hancock's mansion before its demolition, again, John Hancock's mansion stood at the site of the current State House, was overtaken by emotion as he realized that a signer of the Declaration of Independence had touched the doorknob of this house. He describes the, quote, first stirring of poetic sentiment working in the mind of a rude nature. Let it ripen, and his hand would be clasped with that of Boston so tightly that no theory of white race or black race could break the Union. Sounds good. So that was his image of what could be achieved if this spirit were spread throughout and beyond New England, and part of how we do that is by saving our places. Just quick, this is kind of the fun stuff I just wanted to put in here, so we have a little taste of some of the wide range of how money got raised, and all the different people who contributed. So the image at the top there is an image of this basically interior made into something like a fair, sort of an interior fairgrounds. There were stalls set up all throughout inside the meeting house. You paid admission, you got to pay to do different things, and it was all went towards the preservation of the building. The book that you see on the left is actually 2 copies of the 1877, I believe, the Poems of the Old South. 1877 or 1878 was first printed, but that book includes, I believe, six poets' works that were collected and published together in order to sell the collection towards, again, as a fundraiser for the preservation. And the poem that I read a small piece of earlier was one of those poems collected. Actually, one of our pamphlets that we sell here at Old South Meeting House is the text of the speech that Wendell Phillips gave on Flag Day here, so it's easy to look at that. And then here at the bottom right, we have this enlarged version of a card that, anybody know what that is? Who has been here before might recognize? Anybody in the audience know what that card represents? Any guesses? No? All right, let's see, can we read it? Let's see if we can read it with a little bit of help here. Knitted from the first fleece of, I believe it says, Mary's little lamb. So these were cards that were created by Mary Sawyer Tyler, who was the person who the rhyme was written for. There was a real Mary Had a Little Lamb, and it was Mary Sawyer, later Mary Tyler. She was still living in Somerville at this time. I believe she was in her 60s, and she found out about this cause, and she said, well, I've got a couple of pairs of stockings that my mother knit when I was a child from the first shearings of that lamb, her baby lamb, and I could take them apart and cut the wool into little pieces and put it on cards and sign it, and they could be sold as for the meeting house. So that happened. So that one was dated 1880, and I don't know the whole range of, I don't know how many of them were sold. I don't know where they are. I'm still looking. So if you're here, anybody has them, I'd like to know. I mean, I'm guessing there's still some of them floating around, but that was how Mary Had a Little Lamb helped to save Old South Meeting House. And on that note, I will turn things back over to Alison, who will take us a little bit into the present day, and I might say a few quick words at the end.
So I'd like to talk now about the current trends in historic preservation. The preservation movement today still celebrates the roots of our nation's history through the preservation and interpretation of sites associated with our founding fathers, like Boston's famed Freedom Trail, which is right outside the door, and house museums dedicated to wealthy homeowners, like the Gibson House, the Nichols House, and the Otis House, all of which you should go visit if you haven't yet. Here in Boston, we have experienced social and cultural trends over the last 50 or 60 years that have guided our preservation priorities. For example, after World War II, there was a trend across the country for city residents, especially white residents, to move to the suburbs where they built single-family homes and drove their cars to jobs and to new strip malls that were popping up everywhere. Cities like Boston began to decline and faced financial deficits and increases in crime and poverty. To combat this and to encourage more traffic into the city, Boston officials did two things. They built a highway cutting through the city to draw all of those new drivers back from the suburbs, and they demolished an entire neighborhood to start new. I'm sure many of you remember Boston pre-Big Dig. I wasn't here yet, but I've heard a lot about it. The highway literally cut whole neighborhoods off from each other, blocked views and access to the waterfront, and demolished and compromised probably hundreds of historic and culturally significant buildings and sites. As you know, this was an epic failure, and a huge effort to fix it resulted in the Big Dig, which put the highway underground and built open green space and parks in its place. Cities across the country are still trying to find ways to undo similar mistakes made in an era fixated on vehicular traffic, which is a mindset we still struggle with today that continues to cause problems for preservation. The West End was a neighborhood of mostly immigrants that suffered at the hand of urban renewal. To deal with the hardships the city faced, officials decided to start new and build modern buildings like City Hall to attract new businesses and stability to the city. Between 1958 and 1960, the West End neighborhood was almost completely demolished, and new buildings were constructed to reflect the city's attempt to rebrand itself. Not only were the residents of the West End displaced, but the culture and history of the neighborhood was nearly wiped out. Last fall, the director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, Brian Golden, made a formal apology to the West End neighborhood for this tremendous loss. This loss did, however, result in the eventual rejuvenation of Boston and served as a wake-up call for Boston's preservation community. So there is good news. As the importance of historic buildings to a thriving city, especially one like Boston, which is so historic, has become more understood and appreciated, the threat of large-scale destruction has nearly disappeared. With 9 local historic districts and about 100 individual landmarks, Boston protects many of its historic sites through local regulation. With the majority of our most significant historic sites protected or in the hands of good stewards like Old South Meeting House, the preservation community has turned its attention to the more vernacular sites, which reflects a national trend in preservation. Now we advocate more often to preserve the character of our neighborhoods, which encapsulates our collective history rather than the history of a single person or family. Here you see Bromfield Street, which is right around the corner from where we are now. It's one of Boston's oldest commercial corridors, still intact, and is currently threatened by a large development right here on the corner. So there's still work to be done, but cities are beginning to understand that the benefits of historic preservation far outweigh the costs of demolition and new construction in most cases. House museums and historic sites across the country are increasingly researching and interpreting the stories of all those who lived and experienced the sites, including slaves, servants, immigrants, and minorities. For example, the National Park Service has undertaken an initiative to locate, preserve, and recognize sites associated with the LGBTQ movement in the U.S. Also, while preservationists traditionally consider 50 years to be the cutoff for designating a property as eligible for historic recognition, we are beginning to anticipate the preservation needs of the more recent past and identifying structures from the 1970s, 80s, and even 90s that should be protected now for future preservation efforts. Over time, the preservation community has broadened our idea of what is historic and worthy of protecting to be more inclusive of our country's vast cultural background. We are understanding that preservation is not just about the materials that make up buildings, but about the people that designed them, built in them, lived in them, worked in them, and experienced the building as part of their daily lives, and how these places shaped our communities and our history as a whole. In our last segment of the evening, I think Erica's going to come back up and talk a little bit more about how the Old South Meeting House is making some of these connections right here in Boston.
So I wanted to just say a few words about how we here, in different ways, kind of have, in some ways, have, I think, from even that early stage, was kind of what we were doing and how people talked about this building was kind of, like I said before, somewhat inclusive and democratic, but more and more we've put an emphasis on having multiple stories involved with the stories that we tell and how we tell them. I wanted to point out just a few details in this sort of trajectory. In 1929, the Old South Association, after some pretty considerable discussion and debate, enacted a formal free speech policy, and basically making a commitment to make this building available to speakers of whatever opinions, regardless of the unpopularity of the opinions expressed, to make this to make this building open for dialogue, and basically, as I interpret it, dialogue, even some of the most challenging and difficult types of dialogue that might happen. What I have pictured here, this is an announcement from dated August 8th, about the 3rd anniversary memorial of the Sacco and Vanzetti execution. The memorial was held here on August 22nd, held at Old South Meeting House, after having had a great deal of difficulty finding places to meet for the previous 2 years for the anniversary celebrations. And so this came right on the heels of the enactment of this policy, and so that meeting was held here. And I wrote here, in the midst of the tercentenary celebration of the founding of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and in the text here of the announcement, the group that organized this meeting, made it clear that they saw this event as being part of this tercentenary celebration, implying, as I interpreted it, that the injustice done by this execution is something that should be discussed in the context of sort of the pride we take in our history and our heritage, and looked at and sort of up and against the sort of the ideals of how we see ourselves as a state or as a nation. And I'm presuming that the view that this event was part of the tercentenary celebration of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was not embraced by everybody in the larger community. Here we have a little image of our Saving Old South exhibit in the museum. And a lot of what you find in that exhibit is bits and pieces of what I spoke about here today. However, there is inclusion here also of William Lloyd Garrison's a quote that how he basically did not have any interest in preserving Old South Meeting House or in the preservation of this building, because the founding fathers had basically because they had been slaveholders, that they had fought for liberty and justice for all, but not. And so you see that that's sort of, that's being included in the story, even though it's a difficult part of the story. And I think that's really a great symbol of sort of how the story of this building and the mini story of this building kind of get tied in with that free speech policy and that commitment to including all of the different voices and how they might play out. Including the challenging aspects of storylines is part of this building's legacy. And that's the legacy of how it's been used, and it's the legacy of how it's been talked about, and it's the legacy of how it's been preserved. And it's a national story. It's a national story that includes aspects of struggle and contention, and also includes many other stories. And many stories. So this is an example of a recent series of programs that we held here that was called More Voices, Expanding Our Nation's Story. And it's an example of, it says here, the stories, including people of color, Native Americans, teens, museums, travelers, artists, expanding the nation's story. Today, the tagline of Old South Meeting House, if you go to our website, or get an email from one of us, the tagline is "Where the Boston Tea Party Began in 1773." But in order to continue expanding and deepening its connections to a diverse public, the Meeting House needs to continually build on a broader range of voices and stories. The Boston Tea Party, viewed as a grandiose gesture, is not enough for today's preservationists. It wasn't in 1876 either, but it's perhaps less so today. That story is one of many, involving many uses, many communities, and many conversations that make this building and many others so much more than just a building. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could go back to the sale for $1,000, I think you said it was. And was there some sort of inside deal? Because number one, so many people had flocked to save it during the fire. I thought people were on the roof with blankets, et cetera.
Yeah.
And you said the next day there were already people outside. It just seems as though, how did it come about that the sale for $1,000 was able to go through, and then, you know, obviously vastly more amounts of money were raised? Is there a hidden story there, I guess is my question.
You know, I don't feel like I know enough about all the legal sort of technical pieces behind that. What I understand is that it was basically sold for the value of the parts of the building, with the understanding that it was going to be taken down. So the building, I mean, if you looked at the building, it's just as the value of its parts, I guess that was the assessment, that was a fair price. The land under the building was really what was much more valuable at the time. So in order to secure the building and the land, they had to have raised about $400,000. So that was kind of the beginning of the process for getting it back. But I don't know enough about the details of the whole process of securing the sale to fully answer that.
I was just wondering how you fund the preservation of the building now. I know you have memberships, maybe you can talk about that, or how we can become a member and what.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, we are always happy to have to get memberships and other private donations. We are not, people often have the misconception that we are sort of funded by the federal government because we're on the Freedom Trail, but we're not part of the National Park Service, even though we're affiliated with the Boston National Park, but because we're on the Freedom Trail and we have a great working relationship with them. And we are able to, from time to time, we secure funding from them to do preservation projects. We certainly have done that. But we're not part of any governmental agency, so we are an independent nonprofit, so we depend a lot upon private donations and foundation support. And
when was the building built?
This
initially?
building was built in 1729. Yeah, and it was completed in 1729. Construction started in 1728, and then there was an earlier Puritan meeting house on this site that was built in 1669, and that was the building that Benjamin Franklin, his family had been a part of. He was baptized in that building. Often we say Benjamin Franklin was baptized here. Technically, he was baptized in the earlier meeting house that was on this site, which was a smaller wooden building structure. So, all right. All right. Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming.
More so than any other abolitionist, any other American, it was Douglass who understood the implications of his country's love affair, its fascination with this new technology.